Dean Baquet, if we're really going to be a transparent newsroom that debates these issues among ourselves and not on Twitter, I figured I should talk to the whole newsroom, and hear from the whole newsroom. We had a couple of significant missteps, and I know you're concerned about them, and I am, too. But there's something larger at play here. This is a really hard story. Newsrooms haven't confronted one like this since the 1960s. It got trickier after Inaudible went from being a story about whether the Trump campaign had colluded with Russia and obstruction of justice to being a more head-on story about the president's character. We built our newsroom to cover one story, and we did it truly well. Now we have to regroup, and shift resources and emphasis to take on a different story. I'd love your help with that. As Audra Birch said when I talked to her this weekend, this one is a story about what it means to be an American in 2019. It is a story that requires deep investigation into people who peddle hatred, but it is also a story that requires imaginative use of all our muscles to write about race and class in a deeper way than we have in years. In the coming weeks, we'll be assigning some new people to politics who can offer different ways of looking at the world. We'll also ask reporters to write more deeply about the country, race, and other divisions. I really want your help in navigating this story. But I also want to Inaudible this as a forum to say something about who we are and what we stand for. We are an independent news organization, one of the few remaining. And that means there will be stories and journalism of all kinds that will upset our readers and even some of you. I'm not talking about true errors. In those cases, we should listen, own up to them, admit them, show some humility but not wallow in them and move on. What I'm saying is that our readers and some of our staff cheer us when we take on Donald Trump, but they jeer at us when we take on Joe Biden. They sometimes want us to pretend that he was not elected president, but he was elected president. And our job is to figure out why and how and to hold the administration to account. If you're independent, that's what you do. The same newspaper that this week will publish the 1619 Project, the most ambitious examination of the legacy of slavery ever undertaken in an Inaudible newspaper, to try to understand the forces that led to the election of Donald Trump. And that means trying to understand the segment of America that probably does not read us. The same newspaper that can publish a major story on Fox News, and how some of its commentators purvey anti-immigrant conspiracies, also has to talk to people who think immigration may cost them jobs and who oppose abortion on religious grounds. Being independent also means not editing the New York Times for Twitter, which can be unforgiving and toxic. And actually, as Amanda Cox reminds me, doesn't really represent the left or the right. Inaudible who care deeply about the Times and who want us to do better, we should listen to those people. But it is also filled with people who flat out don't like us or who, as Jack Schaefer put it, want us to be something we are not going to be. By the way, let's catch our breath before tweeting stupid stuff or stuff that hurts the paper or treats our own colleagues in a way that we would never treat them in person. It is painful to me personally, and it destabilizes the newsroom when our own staff tweets things they could never write in our own pages or when we attack each other on Twitter. But let me end where I began. This is hard stuff. We're covering a president who lies and says outlandish things. It should summon all of our resources and call upon all of our efforts to build a newsroom where diversity and open discussion is valued. We will make mistakes, and we will talk about them openly. We'll do things that cause us to disagree with each other, but hopefully we'll talk about them openly and wrestle with them. I want your help figuring out how to cover this world. I want the input I need it. So now I'm going to open the floor to questions. Staffer, could you explain your decision not to more regularly use the word racist in reference to the president's actions? Baquet, yeah, I'm actually almost practiced at this one now. Look, my own view is that the best way to capture a remark, like the kinds of remarks the president makes, is to use them, to lay it out in perspective. That is much more powerful than the use of a word. The weekend when some news organizations used the word racist, and I chose not to, we ran what I think is the most powerful story anybody ran that weekend. Inaudible Chief White House Correspondent Peter Baker, who stepped back and took Trump's remarks, looked at his whole history of using remarks like that, and I think it was more powerful than any one word. My own view? You quote the remarks. I'm not saying we would never use the word racist. I'm talking about that weekend. You quote the remarks. The most powerful journalism I have ever read, and that I've ever witnessed, was when writers actually just described what they heard and put them in some perspective. I just think that's more powerful. Staffer, but what is inaudible? The use of a very clear word, most people inaudible. Baquet, I think that word, it loses its power by the second or third time. I do. I think that these words. Can I talk about the use of the word lie for 1 second? Staffer, as long as you come back to my original question. Baquet, I will. I'm not running away from you, you know me. I used the word lie once during the presidential campaign, used it a couple times after that. And it was pretty clear it was a lie, and we were the first ones to use it. But I fear that if we used it 20 times, 10 times, first, it would lose its power. And secondly, I thought we would find ourselves in the uncomfortable position of deciding which comment by which politician fit the word lie. I feel the same way about the word racist. I think that a bizarre sort of litmus test has been created. If you don't use the word racist, you're not quite capturing what the president said. I'm going to argue that, first off, if you go back and look at what Peter Baker wrote that weekend, it was more powerful than the news organizations that just tossed the word out lightly as the first thing. Secondly, I'm going to ask you to go back and read the most powerful journalism of the civil rights movement. The most powerful journalism of the civil rights movement, for instance, Joe Lelyvelt's portrait of Philadelphia, Mississippi, after the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, were vivid descriptions of what people in Philadelphia, Mississippi, said and how they behaved. The lead of the story described an old white man sitting on his front porch, saying that the town wasn't racist, saying that everybody lived peacefully in the town. And as he was saying that, a much older black man walked by, and the guy called him boy. That is 20 times more powerful, by my lights, than to use the word racist. If the lead of that story had been Philadelphia, Mississippi, is a racist town, it would have been true, but it wouldn't have been as powerful. I don't expect everybody to agree with me. In fact, some of the people who were in the discussion that weekend don't agree with me, but that's how I feel, strongly. Staffer, hi. Thank you so much for doing this. I guess I have a two-part question. The first part is, would it be fair to say that, if contributing op-ed writer Roxana Gay hadn't tweeted out what she tweeted out, that we wouldn't be having this conversation right now? And if that is true, or, regardless of whether it's true, I think that something that some people have been wondering is, do you feel that there is a person in a high position of power who can be as explicitly self-critical of this organization as Roxana Gay has, and is in a position to be? Because she's on the outside? Do you think that we would benefit from that? Baquet, I know what you're getting at. This is a roundabout public editor question, right? Staffer, no, it's not. It's just true. I mean, I don't know if Roxana hadn't shared those tweets or those emails, whether we'd be having this conversation. Baquet, well, all I can say is, long before that happened I was out in the world meeting with groups of people, having one-on-one discussions with people. Meeting with, like, large groups of people who wanted to talk about using the words. I gave 3 interviews in one day. I mean, it's possible, but I guess I think that maybe I'm kidding myself, and tell me if I am. I guess I think that we have been having self-critical discussions before that. Do you all think we haven't had enough of them? Let me turn it to you all, to the room. Staffer, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's that much comfort with having certain kinds of discussions. And I think understanding that certain people's jobs weren't at risk, and that it was explicitly their job to be critical, is something that some people might relish or appreciate. Baquet, well, let me say something I would relish and appreciate. I would relish and appreciate anybody who wants to come to my office. And some of you have a lot of people have to tell me when there are things you don't like about the New York Times. I get the question about having an outside critic, and it's an interesting one. But to be frank, the best thing we can do is have a newsroom where, if you don't like something the newsroom is doing, you can come to me and talk about it. I hope some people feel that way. Some people don't, but I think that's more important. And I promise you, if anybody wants to come talk to me or members of the masthead about anything involving coverage, and I've had 20 conversations in the last 2 weeks with people who disagree with me about coverage, or disagree with me about using the word racist. Who disagree with me about a lot of stuff. We only get through this if we get to the point where we can have those kind of conversations. Staffer, hi. You mentioned that there could be situations when we would use the word racist. What is that standard? Baquet, you know, we actually should have a written standard. I wasn't expecting 2 weeks ago, and Associate Managing Editor for Standards Phil Corbett is working with me and the masthead to come up with it. I can think of examples, like, you know, the governor. Was it the governor of Virginia with the costume? I mean, it's hard for me to answer, but yes, I do think there are instances when we would use it. It's hard for me to articulate an example of it. G. Sulzberger, so I'm no longer in the newsroom, but Dean tends to bring me in on some of these conversations. And I think it's useful sometimes to show the journey a little bit of how we reach these decisions. Because otherwise it can feel a little bit like this is a single case in which we're deciding whether something is or is not racist. The conversation that I heard was really a conversation about labels and about whether we're going to use labels as shorthand for something that we can convey through words and actions and with greater color and detail. And the moment that, for me, really hammered home the risk of some of these labels was actually when someone passed along to me a headline that we had run 6 months before, the Trump makes comments condemned as racist headline. And the headline we had used 6 months before was, Omar makes comments condemned as anti-Semitic. And the amount of pushback that I and others received in that moment from leaders in the Jewish community was really considerable. People wanted us to call this phrase, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," an anti-Semitic phrase. They pointed out that this is actually an historically anti-Semitic trope. Though that it was an anti-Semitic trope was actually referred to in the body of the story, which I pointed out. But we're really cautious with labels, because labels tend to slip. They tend to stick to each other. And I think that the conversation I heard Dean and other members of the leadership have was about whether or not those types of shortcuts actually end up doing the exact thing that we don't want, which is keep people from reading, would keep people from actually understanding. By giving folks who are inclined to be skeptical that label is fairly applied, whether it's anti-Semitic or racist or anything else, to keep those people from having an easy out not to look at what actually just occurred, and what happened, and what the implications are, and what the effects are on the community. And I think this is a really tricky moment right now. You know, someone did a study of Twitter shares that showed that 70% of all stories shared on Twitter were never opened. And to me, that's just a reminder that so much of the world is judging before they're actually engaging. And I don't think any of us would defend the headline from last week. Not only would you not defend it, we changed it. But I do think that if you take a step further back, and you look at the entire front page, or the entire body of coverage, I actually think that you saw in unmistakable clarity all the themes that we rightfully should be addressing. I just wanted to say that. Staffer, I wanted to ask about the Atlantic interview from last week, where you were talking about how the headline happened, and you said that the copy editors had written inaudible. I believe that was a slip of the tongue. I do. But I think it raises important issues, because the copy desk was in fact inaudible frequently flagged things like this. It was the place that wrote a lot of headlines. I can recall, personally, numerous times on the copy desk when I and my fellow copy editors flagged and got changed problematic headlines or phrasings before they went into print. And I'm just wondering if there has been any discussion of the extent to which streamlined editing system increases the risk of errors like this. Baquet, I don't think this one was the streamlined editing system. I mean, we are having conversations about the streamlined editing system and whether some desks need more help, but I don't think that's what happened here. Staffer, I'm not talking specifically about, was this headline attributable to it? I'm talking about, in general, there are fewer eyes on stories and the copy editors would normally have been. Baquet, I know. I honestly don't think there are fewer eyes on that kind of story. There were a lot of eyes on that particular story. The eyes didn't come in all at the right time. I know. I get what you're saying. I don't think this was a copy desk issue. I really don't. Staffer, to come back to the discussion of the word racist for a second, I'm sensitive to how charged a word it is. I'm sensitive to not using labels. But I was struck a couple of years ago. I went to Little Rock for the 60th anniversary of Central High School. And I went back and I reread Homer Bogart's story, the day it happened, and it was a triple banner headline across the front page. And Homer Bogart, who was a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, his lead was, an impressive array of federal force cowed racist agitators outside Central High School. And I was thinking, wow, that's blunt, it's powerful, it's simple, it's direct. And I was thinking, I wonder if that would ever be the way we would do it today. Baquet, oh, sure. The scene he described is I've actually read this, I've gone back and looked at those stories. I don't think anybody would avoid using the racist in a scene like that. It was only Charlottesville times 100, in a historic moment. I think that headline would appear in the New York Times. And I can say, because. Staffer, the flip side that I worked out. Baquet, but I think you'd also. In a weird way, I would argue that proves my point. That was such a powerful moment in American history. It still resonates in American history. It was such a powerful scene of the American South at that moment, that in that instance, to have not used the word would have been weak. And I think, to me, I would argue that that proves my point. Staffer, but the part that got me a little bit worried about is, if you compare it to how we would cover Charlottesville, which is different, sometimes we use these other words that sound like euphemisms or like. Baquet, agree. Staffer, white nationalists who are racially tinged, or we use things that seem to normalize and clean up and sanitize an ugly reality. Baquet, yeah, I hate racially tinged, racially charged, too. I think those are worse. If you're going to do what I said, if you're gonna put your money where your mouth is and actually just describe it, you shouldn't use sort of half-assed words like racially charged or racially tinged either. You should either say it when the moment comes or you should describe the scene. I agree with that. Staffer, hello, I have another question about racism. I'm wondering to what extent you think that the fact of racism and white supremacy being sort of the foundation of this country should play into our reporting. Just because it feels to me like it should be a starting point, Like these conversations about what is racist, what isn't racist. I just feel like racism is in everything. It should be considered in our science reporting, in our culture reporting, in our national reporting. And so, to me, it's less about the individual instances of racism, and sort of how we're thinking about racism and white supremacy as the foundation of all of the systems in the country. And I think particularly as we are launching a 1619 project, I feel like that's going to open us up to even more criticism from people who are like, okay, well you're saying this, and you're producing this big project about this. But are you guys actually considering this in your daily reporting? Baquet, it's interesting, the argument you just made, to go back to the use of the word racist. I didn't agree with all of this from Keith Woods, who I know from New Orleans and who's the ombudsman for NPR. He wrote a piece about why he wouldn't have used the word racist, and his argument, which is pretty provocative, boils down to this: pretty much everything is racist. His view is that a huge percentage of American conversation is racist, so why isolate this one comment from Donald Trump? His argument is that he could cite things that people say in their everyday lives that we don't characterize that way, which is always interesting. You know, I don't know how to answer that, other than I do think that race has always played a huge part in the American story. And I do think that race and understanding of race should be a part of how we cover the American story. Sometimes news organizations sort of forget that in the moment. But of course it should be. I mean, one reason we all signed off on the 1619 project and made it so ambitious and expansive was to teach our readers to think a little bit more like that. Race in the next year, and I think this is, to be frank, what I would hope you come away from this discussion with. Race in the next year is going to be a huge part of the American story. And I mean, race in terms of not only African Americans and their relationship with Donald Trump, but Latinos and immigration. And I think that one of the things I would love to come out of this with is for people to feel very comfortable coming to me and saying, here's how I would like you to consider telling that story. Because the reason you have a diverse newsroom, to be frank, is so that you can have people pull together to try to tell that story. I think that's the closest answer I can come. Staffer, yet, I want to follow up and disentangle a couple of things that I've often seen conflated in these meetings. You have questions like, should we call Donald Trump a racist, and these broader discussions of our coverage getting flattened with the reason that I think we're here today, which is really narrowly the question of how we present the work that we do and the headlines that end up on our work. Because this is sort of the thing that a lot of us who are, in some capacity, public representatives of the Times feel ourselves called to answer for. Because there are these patterns of getting headlines wrong in a very specific way that recur repeatedly and in a way that makes me think that it's a process issue. And to me, the question of whether you put a phrase like racial fires in a headline is not actually about whether we think it's okay to call Donald Trump racist. It's whether we think it's okay to use euphemisms instead of direct, clear speech in a headline. Which I think is a question you would ask of any administration. And the issue with last week's headline was not really about Trump per se. It was really more broadly about what kind of credulousness we want to reflect in terms of an administration, any administration. Or about other cases where we're sort of shying away from the real content of the story to put a milder spin on it in the headline, which is sometimes actively misleading. And the process by which these headlines end up on stories is often kind of opaque, and it's not always clear whether we're taking on board the criticism that I think is very valid of a lot of these headlines. It is a real storyline about the Times out there now, that we are kind of repeatedly making mistakes that other people aren't making so much. And it is something that's kind of baffling to me from where I sit, and I guess I'm curious, what is our process? How are we thinking about it? Do we perceive ourselves making the same errors repeatedly, or do we see these as sort of isolated episodes? Baquet, I'm going to be really honest. I actually don't think we make a whole lot more mistakes. I think I've made clear I'm going to own up to my mistakes. I don't think we make a whole lot more mistakes than the Washington Post or anywhere else. After the headline issue came up, I think I heard from 10 executive editors, pretty much every major news organization. My favorite one was from somebody, I guess I shouldn't use their names, was somebody who said, I wish people cared about my headlines as much as they care about yours. Look, we are scrutinized. I ran another newspaper. I've never seen anything like this. We are scrutinized more than any other news organization in the country, in the world probably. To be frank, some of that comes with being the biggest and, I would argue, the best. And as hard as it is to do this, I think we have to accept it. We have to accept that maybe what goes along with being the New York Times is that we get scrutinized more. Maybe we should even say we deserve it more. You know? That's the position I'm going to take. I mean, it's almost funny when I read all of the attacks on the New York Times for not having a public editor. Nobody has a public editor. We're not the only ones that made the decision to not have a public editor. My main point is, yeah, we do get beat up more. And I think we just have to own up to inaudible in the process. Should I, Do you want me to walk through what happened in this headline again, or is that? Staffer, I would like to know. I mean, I think in this specific case that's now been made public. But in general, kind of, how does this happen? Baquet, I mean, I think that if I had to, and I will, engage in a little bit of self-criticism, I made a decision. So we're talking about print headlines here for a second. I made a decision that I still think was the right decision for the New York Times. We're not just a print newspaper anymore. We have a television show. We have a podcast. We have a daily website that reaches tens of millions of people. I thought that the days when the executive editor sat and sort of picked the stories, fly-specked the headlines. I just thought that that was sending the wrong signal to the room. What does that say to our video team if executive editor only cares about the print front page? I also, by the way, assembled a remarkable group of people who worry over the print front page. I'm going to also say that nobody puts out a print front page like the New York Times. Don't let getting whacked the last couple of weeks make you forget that. But I think I should probably spend a little more time thinking about it. You know, again, I've said half of the big decisions I've had to make as executive editor I've made in my bathrobe at home. You know, I didn't look closely enough at it. I should make sure that the front page of the New York Times, which is still our glory, gets more scrutiny than it does, and we should all look at it. In this case, I've said it before, I think the layout boxed in the print hub in a way that probably made it impossible to put a great headline on it. But I think I should probably spend a little more stewing on the front page. Does that answer your question? Staffer, kind of. I mean, I think. Baquet, push. Push, man. They've never been shy. Staffer, I do think, I mean, I guess I see it as not a matter of like getting beat up over the past couple weeks. I feel like there's a sort of weariness with the share of the criticism directed towards us that is about the headlines that detracts from the discussion that we'd like to be having about the actual inaudible. Baquet, I agree, but I'm going to say one thing. And then Associate Managing Editor and Metro Editor Cliff Levy wants to say something. We let it distract us, if you don't mind my saying. You know, there's a little bit of, there are HR people in the room? There's a little bit of a wallowing gene in the New York Times. Look, I don't think any executive editor has owned up to more mistakes than I have. I don't know if that means I've made more mistakes. Maybe it does. Or if it means I just believe in transparently owning up to your mistakes. But the last few months of the New York Times, we have produced some remarkable reports. Before I came in here, somebody from the national desk sent me a note pointing out just how amazing our coverage of El Paso was and how much it happened to have been driven by Latino reporters who felt powerfully about that story and wanted to surface it. We've got to move away from the position where we want to just beat ourselves up and not think about that stuff a little bit, too. Cliff wanted to say something. Cliff Levy, I just want to kind of delicately push back a little bit on this question of headlines. Headlines are very, very hard, as you well know. I spent a lot of time thinking about headlines. My colleagues on Metro might tell you that I'm kind of obsessed with them in an unhealthy way. A lot of the pushback that we often receive about headlines, particularly on social media, is from people who have never written a headline, don't have an understanding of how hard it is, the burdens on a headline. Particularly the burdens on a headline in print space where you are really limited. But the burdens in digital, as well. We are limited by length and SEO and all these other factors. People who criticize our headlines, particularly people who are not in this newsroom, you'll say to them, well, what would you want this headline to be? And they repeat back something to you that's like 15 lines or 15 words. You know, people want headlines that blitz out any nuance. They want headlines that say, Donald Trump is a racist, or Donald Trump is a liar, or things that really take out all the texture and fabric of the article itself. And I will just say, you know, they're extremely hard to do well, and I think in general we do them extremely well. And I think Phil would probably want to add something to that. Philip Corbett, I did want to push back just a little bit more. Sorry, we're all pushing back on you. This might not be a widely held view, but I would dispute the idea that when we have made mistakes about headlines in the last months or couple of years that they have always been in the same direction, which I think is how you put it. In other words, that the mistakes you're seeing are when we're going, shall we say, too easy on Donald Trump. There certainly have been headlines where I feel like that has been a failing. But I will say, honestly, there have been headlines that many of us have been concerned about or asked to have changed or have had discussion about where I felt the problem was the opposite. Where we were showing what could be read as bias against Trump, and were perhaps going too far in the opposite direction. So this goes to Cliff's point that headlines are hard to write anyway, and we're going to get them wrong sometimes. But I would not accept the criticism that the ones we get wrong necessarily show that we're bending over backwards in one direction, because I've definitely seen headlines that I've been uncomfortable with that have fallen too far on both sides of the line. Staffer, so I share the concerns about how coverage can be done aggressively, but not from a default point of view, which can feed into outcomes that repeatedly read to a number of people across the newsroom and then outside as well being too cautious or winding up in a zone that fails to accurately represent the situation to the readers. Which is, of course, the mission that we all do believe in. And I have had conversations and exchanges with a number of colleagues in different roles, from different backgrounds across the newsroom in the past week. And one of the things that I've brought up, and I know, Dean, you and I have talked about this a bit, too, is that some people, despite your welcoming stance as far as bringing feedback to you, are hesitant to speak up. Or don't necessarily feel like they can do that safely, or have the standing to do that. Or some may not even have the access to do that. I wondered if it would be okay for me to share some of the feedback that I got that people asked for to be anonymous, but that I thought was thoughtful and could be useful. Baquet, sure. Staffer, okay, so here's just a selection that I thought was thoughtful. Saying something like divisive or racially charged is so euphemistic. Our style book would never allow it in other circumstances. I am concerned that the Times is failing to rise to the challenge of a historical moment. What I have heard from top leadership is a conservative approach that I don't think honors the Times' powerful history of adversarial journalism. I think that the NYT's leadership, perhaps in an effort to preserve the institution of the Times, is allowing itself to be boxed in and hamstrung. This obviously applies to the race coverage. The headline represented utter denial, unawareness of what we can all observe with our eyes and ears. It was pure face value. I think this actually ends up doing the opposite of what the leadership claims it does. A headline like that simply amplifies without critique the desired narrative of the most powerful figure in the country. If the Times' mission is now to take at face value and simply repeat the claims of the powerful, that's news to me. I'm not sure the Times leadership appreciates the damage it does to our reputation and standing when we fail to call things like they are. And then this is a question that is more specifically about the process that you are also addressing: why are we passing off the biggest, most important part of the stories that we know very well? This is from a writer that we know very well to this strangely anonymized print hub. I am often completely unaware of who is even writing the headlines for my stories. Why can't I or one of the editors who actually worked on the story just write it? Staffer, you know, I hurt the print hub in this case because I didn't think sufficiently about. We had created a front page, because we had two big stories, one of which had a 2-column headline. One had a single line, 4-column headline. It was designed with the print hub, but I don't think I sat and thought about, what can you really say in 4 words? Right? Now, I do not scrutinize the print hub headlines before it goes to press. I happen to think that many of the people on the print hub are some of our best editors and are extremely talented. The second I saw that headline, I always get the front page that night, I kind of put my head in the hands. And I called in before I knew there was a Twitter storm and said, you know, this is off. We've really got to fix this. But I think in some ways, you know, those of us involved that day did a disservice to our colleagues, because it was a very hard thing to write. They were writing it on deadline. And because the headline had seemed fine on the web all day, it didn't occur to me it would be problematic. But on the web they had a very large banner, and I think one of the things we've learned is that, if we're going to do something that's a banner, more of us should be involved. But I think I should have thought more about, if you have just 4 words, what can you write? I had been envisioning something like a day of reckoning. Staffer: Hi, I actually wanted to raise a different issue, not to stop the discussion about language. About the push for social media and audience engagement, it's very clear that the direction of the paper and of management is to incentivize and reward more engagement on social media. But then you have the things that get the most traffic on social media or something like people's Twitter accounts, where it might push them to write inflammatory or stupid or ill-thought-out things. So we're kind of incentivizing people to get eyes, but that also incentivizes people to say stupid things on social media. Baquet: other people can jump in here. I'm sort of unconvinced that the tweets that have made me uncomfortable happened because people wanted to get eyes. I mean, I don't think the tweet that sparked part of this discussion, from an editor in the Washington Bureau, was because he wanted to get eyes. I think he just... We somehow have convinced ourselves that Twitter is not the real world, and that you can say things on Twitter that you wouldn't be able to say in a newspaper story. And we need to just convince ourselves that that is not true. I mean, others should jump in, but I'm not sure that the tweets that have made me uncomfortable are tweets that were just done to attract attention. But others? Staffer: I'm wondering what is the overall strategy here for getting us through this administration and the way we cover it. Because I think one of the reasons people have such a problem with a headline like this or some things that the New York Times reports on is because they care so much. And they depend on the New York Times. They are depending on us to keep kicking down the doors and getting through, because they need that right now. It's a very scary time. And when something like this happens, or we have opinion columnists because people really can't tell the difference between op-eds and news anymore, but when we have people who post and tweet incendiary things, like Bret Stephens, people don't understand. I think they get confused as to what we're trying to do. Baquet: Yeah. Staffer: And I'm just wondering, how can we tighten that up? Baquet: Are you talking about coverage, or are you talking about social media? Staffer: I'm talking about all of it. Baquet: Okay. I mean, let me go back a little bit for 1 second to just repeat what I said in my short preamble about coverage. Chapter 1 of the story of Donald Trump, not only for our newsroom but, frankly, for our readers, was, did Donald Trump have untoward relationships with the Russians, and was there obstruction of justice? That was a really hard story, by the way, let's not forget that. We set ourselves up to cover that story. I'm going to say it. We won 2 Pulitzer Prizes covering that story. And I think we covered that story better than anybody else. The day Bob Mueller walked off that witness stand, 2 things happened. Our readers who want Donald Trump to go away suddenly thought, holy shit, Bob Mueller is not going to do it. And Donald Trump got a little emboldened politically, I think. Because, for obvious reasons. And I think that the story changed. A lot of the stuff we're talking about started to emerge like 6 or 7 weeks ago. We're a little tiny bit flat-footed. I mean, that's what happens when a story looks a certain way for 2 years. Right? I think that we've got to change. I mean, the vision for coverage for the next 2 years is what I talked about earlier. How do we cover a guy who makes these kinds of remarks? How do we cover the world's reaction to him? How do we do that while continuing to cover his policies? How do we cover America, that's become so divided by Donald Trump? How do we grapple with all the stuff you all are talking about? How do we write about race in a thoughtful way, something we haven't done in a large way in a long time? That, to me, is the vision for coverage. You all are going to have to help us shape that vision. But I think that's what we're going to have to do for the rest of the next 2 years. This is no longer a story where the Washington Bureau every week nails some giant story by Washington correspondent Mike Schmidt that says that Donald Trump or Don McGahn did this. That will remain part of the story, but this is a different story now. This is a story that's going to call on different muscles for us. The next few weeks, we're gonna have to figure out what those muscles are. In terms of how to keep people from having these discussions on social media, I'm not 100% sure. I think we should tighten the rules a little, which always upsets people a little bit. I mean, there were tweets that people at the New York Times retweeted or liked last week that were really painful for this newsroom and for me personally. So I'm gonna keep saying that, and maybe we should talk about the rules, too. Staffer, it appears to be that the public narrative around the headline is different from the internal narrative that I've been hearing. So for example, I know that the copy desk thing was a slip. But I have also heard that someone actually raised concerns about the headline and was overruled. So, I'm just trying to reconcile what I'm hearing from my coworkers internally and what I'm hearing from my other coworkers in the public. Baquet, I reached out to the person who raised questions about the coverage that day, who works on the print hub, and it's a little more complicated than that. She was leaving town, and I was leaving town. She thought it was a bad headline, but mainly she thought that particular story shouldn't lead the paper. Her complaint was different than the narrative that has developed, which is that one person on the print hub threw their body in front of the headline. In my exchanges with her, that wasn't the case. She thought that that story should not have led the paper. And she thought the headline was bad, but mainly she thought the whole package, the whole architecture, but mainly the story is what was wrong. And I told her frankly, in my exchange with her, which was good and helpful, I said, look, I disagree with you on this one. I'm happy to sit down and talk to you in person. I thought that was the right lead of the paper. I would not have minded, by the way, if she'd wandered into my office, knocked on the door, which I told her and which I will keep telling her when I talk to her in person. If she had come in and said, I think you picked the wrong lead of the paper, that's a little bit of a different narrative from the headline narratives. That makes sense? Staffer, hi. I just kind of wanted to return to the internal debate before the headline went to print. Do you think there was a breakdown there other than space pressure or time pressure? And if so, I wonder what you think that breakdown was? Baquet, again, I had this exchange with an editor as she was going away and I was going away. I'm not sure that was a breakdown. I think the breakdown was that we drew a page that was really, really, really hard to put a thoughtful headline on. This was a really complicated story. It was not a story that said, Trump said X. In fact, what was wrong with the story is that the Trump said X headline wasn't enough to capture the hypocrisy and all the kind of nuance we're talking about. So I think we built a page on deadline that made it really hard to put a headline on it. So we set it up for a bad headline, and the people who were in a position to judge it quickly and change it, like me, did not look at it until too late. So I guess this is a system breakdown. We didn't have a system in place where the people who would recognize it and then change it, and maybe, by the way, the right change, if you want me to tell you the perfect scenario for this headline would have been like this: the print hub. I'm not blaming the print hub, I'm blaming me. Because I set up this system, the print hub comes in and says, we tried, we cannot put a headline on that story with this layout. You need to redraw the page. We would have redrawn the page in a way that allowed us to put a more nuanced headline on it. That would have been, in retrospect, the ideal situation. Staffer, but the editors were looking at it. Do you have the impression that they felt that that was necessary, or there was a recognition that there was a problem? Baquet, I should ask Associate Masthead Editor Tom Jolly and others on the print hub. I mean, there was a recognition among the masthead when it got sent around. As soon as the mock-up of the front page got passed around, I looked at it. Matt looked at it. Everybody looked at it and said, oh shit. The first edition had already closed, so that was a system breakdown. Does that answer it? I'm trying to walk you through the process a little bit. Go ahead. Staffer, it just seems like the people who could have recognized that, perhaps, did not or were not on the team to look at the first edition. Baquet, Tom, do you have a thought about that? Tom runs the print hub. Tom Jolly, well, I think, the problem was that the editor felt like that difficult headline had to tie directly into the lead story. If we had made it a broader headline that addressed the package of 4 different stories, the Day of Reckoning or something along those lines, it would have solved it. In terms of a system problem, Print Hub had a meeting Thursday, and one of the things that we've realized is, we need to be looking at the front page. First of all, we need to be talking to the editors who are going to be writing the headlines that come in late afternoon. They're not a part of the discussion during the day. We need to talk to them, give them a sense of what the storyline is. And then we need to review the page before it comes out. One of the problems here was that the page was already published, and that page goes to half of our print readers. So at that point, there was no bringing it back. Right? So yes, we've addressed system issues that we've identified, and I've also talked with the editor from the stories going around. And she doesn't feel that she was rebuffed. Obviously, we would never want that to happen. And I think, as Dean explained, that was a little bit of a bigger issue. But I think the biggest thing is discussing the storyline at a time in the late afternoon or early evening when the editors who are just coming in have an opportunity to think it out one more time. Baquet, can I say something in support of the Print Hub? Because just for the record, I'm not sure I love this narrative of these sort of anonymous editors sitting on another floor fucking up the New York Times. The Print Hub builds the front page of the New York Times every day. Pick up today's front page. It is a thing of beauty. They do it every day. They're not some anonymous nobodies. They're fine journalists, assembled from across the newsroom, assembled from other news organizations. The original sin, I can say since I'm a Catholic and a former altar boy, the original sin was ours. Was setting up a front page that was really, really difficult to build a headline around. But do not go visit the Print Hub. I mean, these are journalists just like us. I talked to the editor who wrote the headline. He's sick, I mean, he feels terrible. He feels more terrible than he should, to be frank. But it feels terrible, and I don't want to walk away from this with all of us thinking that they're a group of fumble fingers on another floor of the New York Times secretly fucking up the New York Times. They're not. One more. Staffer, when it came to actually changing that headline, how much influence did the reader input have? I mean, okay, all you guys didn't like it. You were unhappy. But was a change in the works, or was it the response? Baquet, it was a fucking mess, we were all over the headline. Me. Matt. The Print Hub. Probably Assistant Managing Editor Allison Mitchell. We were all over it, and then in the middle of it, Deputy Managing Editor Rebecca Blumenstein sent an email, but we were already messing with it saying, you should know, there's a social media firestorm over the headline. My reaction inaudible was not polite. My reaction was to essentially say, fuck 'em, we're already working on it. And we were working on it, on deadline. We had already lost half of the papers, and it was too late to redraw the whole page. We would have lost the whole thing. Baquet, can I just say one thing? This is a hard story. This is larger than the headline. This is larger than the other stuff. This is a really hard story. This is a story that's going to call on like all of our muscles, all of our resources, all of our creativity, all of our empathy. Including all of our empathy for each other. It's going to call on us to be maybe a little less harsh with each other, because we're gonna make other mistakes. It's going to call on us to listen to each other more, including me listening to you all more. If you ask me how we end up getting through this with the best coverage, it's by having honest conversations. It's by inviting people into the Trump story who ordinarily might not have played on stories like this and making sure they get to participate in the coverage. But I hope this is a start, and I hope people take me at my word when I say you may come into me and tell me something you don't like. I may not agree with you. I will be direct, and I will say I don't agree with you. But I promise you I will listen, and I promise you that in the end all of this influences the coverage. So thank you. Thank you.